Thanos versus an entire universe of superheroes. Infinity War. An epic film with an epic budget that had an ending that shocked audiences.
And then I felt it here. I'm like, no, and that's...
Don't worry, no spoilers here. What can a movie about superpowers, infinity stones, and a talking raccoon tell us about the real world? A real world where we worry not that Iron Man might be overmatched by Thanos, but that people might be overmatched against the forces of globalization and automation. If we dig deeper, we'll find that Infinity War provides a door to better understand just how globalized our world has become. To help us on this journey, we've recruited two experts on the global economy. Ian Bremmer, political scientist, best-selling author, and founder of Eurasia Group Foundation. And Tyler Cowen, economist, also best-selling author, and professor at George Mason University.
I think what's fantastic about Infinity War is that it was truly a global production. Most of the production was not just done in Hollywood. It was all over the world with people and ideas and actors, kids and adults. All over the world were excited about the countdown for the release of this film, which, by the way, was happening on top of the tallest building in the world in Dubai.
I don't like most comic book movies. For me, a movie is about dialogue and drama. Godzilla is my favorite superhero.
$230 million people watched the Infinity War trailer in the first 24 hours. The interwebs were abuzz from seemingly every corner of the planet. It set records across the globe and opened #1 in 52 countries.
It was the largest opening weekend of any movie in history, and it was also the fastest to get to $1 billion in just over a week in revenues. It's just really staggering to think about.
So he's sort of built out of radiation. He's a giant lizard. He saves Japan. He represents symbolism about nuclear weapons.
I mean, in a world where so many things feel like we're coming apart, this shows you how one of the most important dynamics in the world today of people coming together around something that you could say is kind of silly. It's a superhero movie.
Forget about the other stuff. Godzilla.
In the end, while Infinity War broke records domestically, its international revenue more than doubled that from the US and Canada. Other movies are seeing a parallel trend. The international market is more important than ever.
If you're a Hollywood movie maker, it is now the case that very often more than half of your revenue comes from other countries. So you've got to think, what can I put in my movie that will translate well to other cultures, other languages? And I will tell you, special effects, explosions, big events on the screen, they work really well in a large number of different countries.
Filmmakers also have to think about how their movies will play with different cultures. For example, in Inside Out, the filmmakers at Pixar created an alternate version of the film that eliminated broccoli, which American kids loathe and Japanese kids love.
And replaced them with green peppers, which Japanese children find revolting.
International fan bases not only mean bigger budgets, but more variety. Whether your niche is extreme sports, anime, or Iranian drama, there's plenty to choose from.
And these movies don't make most of their money in their native countries. They're able to survive and flourish because there are these global markets.
Globalization has transformed movie making. You can collaborate across borders, build international fan bases, and create niche content. Plus, learn what veggies Japanese kids find revolting. This isn't just in the movies. Globalization is remaking virtually every sector of the economy. What do these trends mean for future jobs, future society? To answer that, we need to step back and see how we got here. We'll go through the 4 levels of globalization. We'll start with Globalization 1.0. This is life in the village. Transportation was expensive, dangerous, and slow. You can hop a slow sailboat that is pretty likely to sink, or take your chances on foot. Trade was limited to luxuries for the wealthy and essential raw materials. Think jewelry, spices, and copper. The average person's life wasn't affected by trade. The goods they consumed were local. The information and ideas they consumed were local. They came from people in their village or town.
So before the railroad came, You know, it was actually the case that in New York City, they produced the milk right in Manhattan. And that's where you would get your milk. The cow would be in Manhattan.
Even big, monumental ideas were slow to migrate. It took 200 years for the idea of the compass to get from China to Europe. So how do we get to the next level? Developing cheap and fast transportation of goods. Think better ships and navigation technology, then steam power, steamships and railroads, and cars, trucks, airplanes, and container ships. This unlocked Globalization 2.0. This is life with world trade. No longer did you just consume what was local. The goods you consumed came from all over the globe. World trade explodes in the 1800s.
So what happened with the spread of canals and railroads, you ended up having the cows in upper New York State, and the milk would be shipped in, and that's what enabled New York City to become so interesting, so cultural, so vibrant, such a financial center, basically getting the cows out of Manhattan.
This trade benefited dairy farms as well. They scaled up and specialized, producing higher quality milk at lower prices. It wasn't just milk. Growth in trade allowed businesses of all types to leverage machinery to produce much more than previously imagined. We get the Industrial Revolution, which transforms living standards around the world. But while movement of goods was cheap, movement of information and ideas was still too slow. There's no computers, no internet, and phone calls were pricey. This means that people working together have to be physically in the same place. We see the rise of huge factories like Ford in Detroit. Back then, if you bought a Ford, it was not just made in the USA. It was made almost entirely in one single place. So how do we get to the next level? We figured out cheap and fast communication. Personal computers, the internet, GPS, email, smartphones, and cloud computing. This unlocked Globalization 3.0. This is life in the information revolution. Information was no longer slow. Now you could easily consume information and ideas from all over the globe. This communication revolution allowed companies to coordinate production around the world. What used to be a big factory could now be sliced and diced into what's called a global supply chain. Different pieces of the production could happen all over the planet. Take the iPhone. Over 200 companies from across the globe make different components. When Apple competes with Samsung, it's not an American product versus a Korean product, but Apple's global supply chain versus Samsung's global supply chain. So what does Made in the USA exactly mean today? Does it surprise you that as of 2018, the Honda Ridgeline is more American-made than the Ford F-150, Chevy Silverado, or Dodge Ram? However, these global supply chains rapidly evolve, so by the time you watch this, it's likely to be different.
You want to feel good about saying, I'm buying something that's made, sort of in this place. And the reality is that we've got to get comfortable with the idea that we have one global economy, and that every good that you consume, every good that you wear, everything that we use to function on the planet turns out to pretty much come from the planet.
These communication networks also mean that we get exposed to a wider variety of products at faster and faster rates. It took the internet 7 years to reach 50 million users. How long did it take Pokemon Go? 19 days. Gangnam Style introduced the world to K-pop and was the first video to reach 1 billion views. A Puerto Rican artist was the first to reach 5 billion. So you might be wondering, what's this last level? We haven't unlocked Globalization 4.0 yet, so this might seem a bit crazy. But let's take a peek into the future to see what life will be like in the virtual presence revolution. An example will help explain. If you're a surgeon, you have to be in the room with the patient to operate.
Hello there.
Or do you? What if a surgeon could be in New York operating remotely on a patient in France
Bonjour.
through the use of a robot? This has already happened. Remote surgery is still rare, but as the technology improves, this will become more common. Where else might this spread? Could a German mechanic fix a piece of machinery in Korea? Could a security guard in India watch over a store thousands of miles away? Might your hologram allow you to deliver a speech from home while not wearing pants? It's already possible. When you combine these forces of globalization with the rise of automation and artificial intelligence, what does all this mean for future jobs? Are there winners and losers? How might someone position themselves to benefit from globalization? Stay tuned. We'll tackle these questions in upcoming videos. Next up, we'll explore how jobs are affected by globalization and automation. Click next video to keep learning. Infinity War is known for its spectacular special effects, but we can be pretty certain that in a couple of decades, they'll look old and outdated. That's just the way it goes with movies.
The first adult movie that I ever saw was the original Jaws in summer camp. It was terrifying, and now you go back and look at the mechanical shark that jumped onto the boat, the great white, over 20 feet long, thrashing about, and you go, that is a ridiculous, stupid-looking thing. So I feel pretty clear that we have come a long way since the 70s in terms of, sort of graphics.
This constant improvement is not limited to special effects, sound quality, picture quality, theater seats. You name it, it seems to have improved. Well, maybe not the acting.
Oh, no, not the bees! Not the bees! Ah!
Economists have a term for this type of improvement: creative destruction.
Creative destruction was a term in economics coined by an Austrian economist, Joseph Schumpeter, early in the 20th century. It's really become a central driving idea in economics.
Creative destruction describes the continual process of innovation in which new products and services replace outdated ones. Take photos. We live in a world of smartphones, Instagram, and augmented reality. How we got here reveals a long and winding path of creative destruction.
When I was a kid, you take a photo and Polaroid comes out, you wave it around because you think it's going to make it dry faster. I don't know if that actually worked. And it's several minutes later and it probably doesn't look very good, but you have it. And 10 years later, it's all faded and it probably doesn't keep.
Before the digital era, you might have a Polaroid or you might buy film, typically from Kodak. You had to pay a few dollars for film, which got you about 20 pictures, and then pay more to get them developed. If, whoops, your eyes were shut, too bad. You didn't know until days later. And if you accidentally opened your camera, poof, your pictures are gone. Digital cameras came on the scene at the end of the 20th century. Entrepreneurs quickly improved the cameras, the software, and the accessories. People increasingly switched away from film. It was cheaper, easier, and more enjoyable. These entrepreneurs represent the creative side of creative destruction. But what about the flip side, the destruction? Polaroid employed over 20,000 people in their heyday. Kodak dwarfed Polaroid, employing over 120,000 employees and being one of the most well-known companies in the world. The digital age, while rejoiced by consumers, ushered them both into bankruptcy.
But let's be clear, the people that used to make the Polaroids and the Kodaks don't like that development because they just lost jobs.
Polaroids have had a bit of a resurgence lately as a retro product, but that's actually not the same company that made the originals. That Polaroid is long gone. See, there are two sides of creative destruction. Entrepreneurs inventing new products or ways to save money are how we improve our standard of living. These improvements are the foundation of prosperity and positively impact generation after generation. But the flip side can make jobs or even whole industries go extinct. Unlike the gains, that pain typically subsides. People usually find new jobs. Most of those thousands of employees at Polaroid and Kodak went on to other types of work. When you take the long view, these job changes have historically been beneficial. In the 1800s, more than half of the United States was employed in farming. Because of time-saving inventions like the tractor, farmers now make up less than 2% of the workforce.
Now, you might think, my goodness, those poor farmers, where did they go? What kind of jobs could they possibly have had? But by liberating that labor, we made it possible for people to do things like produce automobiles, produce airplanes, for more people to become entertainers or movie stars, more people to become doctors.
So in the long run, we have fewer people working with film and more building photo apps and the like. However, in the short run, the transition can be extremely painful. If you've spent your life perfecting the craft of developing film, you're not walking out of Kodak and into a sweet gig at Instagram. You might just be out of a job and out of luck. Creative destruction comes in many forms. We often think of the transformative technology like the tractor or the digital camera or the smartphone, which fundamentally changes how we do things. Here's a not-so-obvious source of creative destruction: trade.
Trading with another nation, it is a kind of technology. It's a way of getting something else more cheaply. You're taking things you used to produce, finding a newer, cheaper way of doing it, be it with tractors, with robots, or with foreign trade. And they're all technologies enabling us to produce new and better things more cheaply.
For example, roses used to be grown in the US, raised in heated greenhouses. Now, instead of burning fuel to keep the roses warm, most of our roses come from warm weather climates. This creative destruction has produced a plentiful supply of affordable roses. But just like with Kodak, not everyone benefits. That rose farmer in Pennsylvania isn't thrilled by the introduction of foreign roses. She might be out of a job. More than ever, better education and training programs are needed so that people can transition to new types of work.
Why is this so important now? I do think there's a very specific reason, and that is the nature of jobs and the workplace is changing at an accelerating rate. So the importance of being able to retrain yourself, the importance of being able to learn how to learn, has never been more important than it is today.
Why did Tyler say the workplace is changing at an accelerating rate? Remember how the information revolution allowed companies to slice and dice their factories into a global supply chain? That has increased competition in the workplace. Take Apple. They're evaluating every link of their supply chain. Can they make this step cheaper? Can they make this component better? Back in the old days, employees just had to worry about losing their job to someone nearby. Now they might lose it to a person or robot or software that could come from anywhere on the planet. This means that jobs appear, disappear, and evolve more quickly than ever. That sounds intimidating, but remember, this competition drives the frequent explosions of creative destruction that are the signs of a healthy, vibrant economy. But we can't forget the flip side of the coin. There are those that are hurt by these explosions.
So there's no question that creative destruction has been a great thing for human beings. We just need to remember that the people that are displaced, we have to make sure that we don't forget those people. We have to make sure that they have opportunities too.
Next up, we'll ask, are there winners and losers of globalization? Click next video to keep learning. Are there winners and losers of globalization? That's a big question we could tackle in a variety of ways. Are we talking about who's making more or less money? Whether inequality is better or worse? The environment? We'll tackle all these questions in upcoming videos. Let's start with the question of money. Who's making more or less of it? It's a bit complicated, but with the help of Tyler, Ian, and an elephant, yes, an elephant, we'll get to the answer.
So I think globalization has been good for virtually all groups, but the very biggest winners are the previously quite poor people. Big winners have been the wealthy and the very wealthy. People in the middle have gained, but in percentage terms, by not nearly as much.
What is Tyler talking about? The elephant, of course. Let's take a look at a chart so famous, it got its own mascot. This chart looks at the entire world broken down by income. Over here on the left are the poorest of the poor. Remember, this is of the entire planet. Over here on the right are the most wealthy. If you're poor in a developed country, like the United States, you're not here, not even close. You'd fall somewhere around here. On the vertical, we're going to plot how much these people's living standards grew in 20 years. From 1988 to 2008. 1988 to 2008 are the transformative years of the information revolution. 1988 was still Globalization 2.0. The internet was tiny, the domain of a select few nerds. And a mobile phone looked like this and cost a fortune. The information revolution exploded over the next 2 decades. By 2008, we had graduated to Globalization 3.0. Companies leveraged this technology to slice and dice their factories into global supply chains and automate tasks with robots and software. The elephant visualizes the impact of this 20-year technology transformation. Let's start with the tail of the elephant. This is the poorest 5% of the world, and we don't see much growth. Only a 20% improvement in living standards over 20 years. These people live in countries too remote or too violent or too unpredictable to become integrated into global supply chains. As we move to the right, we can see the story changes quickly. There has been dramatic growth of 50, 60, even 70% in just 20 years. This is the back and the head of the elephant. Here we see the developing nations who were incorporated into these supply chains: India, China, Mexico, Brazil, and the like. For people who study the global economy, this development has been both exciting and inspiring.
That's been the biggest development, not just in terms of globalization, but the entire planet for the last 40 years, is that a whole bunch of countries that we used to call third world, they weren't even on the same planet as us.
There's a village in Mexico I visited many times. In that village, people could starve. If they didn't have a good rain and a good harvest, they just grew corn and hoped each year that they could grow enough corn to eat. People in that village, over time, they've diversified away from growing corn. One thing they do is they make pottery and they paint pictures, and they sell these pictures and pottery abroad. They use email. They use Federal Express. And every year, the income of that village has climbed steadily. So today, there's a school in the village. No one in the village dies of starvation. Life is much more comfortable. There's electricity. People are much happier.
This sort of rise out of extreme poverty has been experienced by 1.1 billion people in the past few decades. 1.1 billion. That number is so big it's hard to wrap your head around. To get to 1.1 billion people, you'd need all of the US, Mexico, and Canada. Twice. Plus a side of France and Saudi Arabia. Seriously. Of course, getting out of extreme poverty isn't the ultimate goal, but it's a good first step. Back to the elephant. If we keep moving to the right, the story gets less rosy. Now we're moving into the working and middle classes of developed countries like the US, Canada, and Western Europe. As you can see, many of them have seen low or even no growth in a generation's time. It doesn't go negative, so in that sense, on average, these people didn't lose money. But it's far below what was expected. This is the trunk of the elephant.
These middle-class workers in the developed economies, they're not only competing more with cheaper labor abroad, but they're also competing more against their own automations in their own countries. So this, too, has to some extent held down wages for some classes of workers.
Does this mean these workers make less than those in China, Mexico, and Brazil? No. Remember, the vertical axis doesn't compare income, but rather growth in income over 20 years. So while these middle-class workers in developed countries have seen much less income growth, because they had a much higher income to begin with, they still make far more than most workers in developing countries. What about the rest of the trunk? The higher you go up the income distribution, the better it gets. The very richest have seen a 70% increase in their incomes over the span. Remember how the Avengers made $1 billion in just 11 days? Those who reach global markets reap unprecedented rewards. Take a highly successful company like Apple. On the one hand, you have the designers, engineers, and marketers who have seen their fortunes rise as Apple's products sell across the globe.
Nice. All right.
On the other hand, Apple products used to be manufactured in the US. But those jobs are gone, either moved overseas or automated.
No hard feelings.
When these middle-class workers look around, they see prosperity for everyone but them. On one side are places like China, India, and Mexico growing rapidly. On the other, they see the wealthy getting much wealthier.
And that is the working and middle class in rich countries. Here in the United States, and in Europe, Canada, Australia even, though no one ever talks about them, but they're a whole damn continent. all of those people suddenly are not getting the opportunities that they were. They believed that their lives were going to get better, and yet over the last 40 years, on balance, they've made no more money. And so as a consequence, you have a large number of people living in the wealthy countries that are really angry about globalization and free trade and open borders. And they're angry with that 1%, the 0.1%, the 0.01% that were telling them that globalization was great, but that didn't actually benefit them. Yeah, they still were able to buy cheaper stuff. But if you no longer have a job and no one's making sure that you still have opportunities, then why would you want to support those people? And that's not just happening in the United States, that's actually happening all over the developed world today.
The natural question is to ask, what's next? Is the next 20 years going to be a repeat of the same elephant? Some other animal? Looking back, the story was the information revolution. Looking forward, it appears to be one of robots and artificial intelligence.
I talk to a lot of business people, and they all tell me that if they need to, they can make more money in the next 10 years with fewer people. That almost every company you can think of is getting transformed by processes of automation that makes it easier for them to get things done. And that's true with banks that don't need as many tellers or as many financial analysts to determine where you should and shouldn't put your money. It can be done by algorithm, right, and trading. Adidas has a new big sneaker company in Germany that has almost no people in it because they can make all of these customized sneakers through a robotic process. Today, the vast majority of manufacturing jobs in the United States that go away are not being stolen by a cheaper worker in China. In fact, one estimate shows almost 90%, 88% of all manufacturing jobs in the US that are displaced are being displaced by robots.
Reporting for duty.
The rise of automation is a source of much consternation in places like the US and Europe. But it might actually impact those countries at the head of the elephant more than anyone else.
So a country like China or like Brazil or Mexico, benefiting enormously from jobs in the United States that went to them in the last 40 years, suddenly will be more vulnerable to the robots and the automation than the United States will be over the coming 10 to 20 years. That's a really significant change in how we think about globalization.
It's time to say goodbye to our elephant. Aggregating the lives of the entire planet into a single graph gives us a window into which groups won big and which did not. However, trying to represent hundreds of millions of lives with a single dot can feel disconnected from what the real impacts are.
Globalization, it's a big concept, and it's important to realize for any concept that big, the correct way to think about it will be highly complex, and there will be many negatives. But overall, the ledger, I think, is strongly positive on behalf of globalization. It's spread health improvements, it's given people longer lives, greater opportunities for children, overall higher wages, many more countries are democracy, and the world today, largely because of globalization, is simply a much better, richer, and freer place than the world I initially grew up with.
In the next videos, we'll go beyond money to talk about inequality, the environment, and more.